Thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Movement. It's a core component of basically every game, and Subnautica is no exception. From the fastest speedruns to the slowest challenges, I'd be willing to wager that basically every Subnautica playthrough ever has involved movement of some kind. But what if it didn't? The premise of this challenge is very simple. I've gone into the settings and unbound every key related to movement. I can't walk, jump, sprint, swim, or use most vehicles. Is it still possible to progress, or maybe even beat the game in this debilitated state? Well, there's only one way to find out. So I booted up a new save, got to watch myself move for the very last time, and prepared to get knocked out. Once I woke up, I was just about able to reach the fire extinguisher and put out the fire. I couldn't actually reach the hatch to leave the life pod, but I was able to climb up and back down the ladder, and this put me on top of the hatch. Once I leave, you might be wondering how I plan on doing, well, really much of anything. You can occasionally get a spawn that's shallow enough to let you collect some acid mushrooms, but without any other materials, that really wouldn't be very useful. Luckily, the game doesn't start you off with absolutely nothing. You get 2 nutrient blocks, 2 bottles of water, 2 flares, and most importantly, the aforementioned fire extinguisher. While most players will only use these things 2 or 3 times in a given playthrough, you might have noticed that you can push yourself around while using one. And since they're tied to right-click and not any of the movement keys, we can actually use them to traverse the world. As for the spawn itself, it was a bit deeper than I would have liked, but there were 2 main things that made up for it. The first was a nearby kelp forest, and the second was a small cave system with a brain coral. This was my first destination, and using the air from the brain coral, I was able to go into the cave and get some resources. Then I snagged a piece of metal salvage and went back to the life pod. I made an oxygen tank, which would give me an extra 30 seconds of air, along with 2 more fire extinguishers. And this brings me to one of the big reasons this run is so hard. Each fire extinguisher costs 3 titanium to make and only has so much fuel. Since they're my only way of getting around right now, if I ever run out of fire extinguishers and don't have enough titanium to make more, I could very well get soft-locked and end up having to restart the whole run. This means I have to be very careful with my trips and collect as much titanium as possible to avoid getting stuck. And bearing that in mind, I headed back out. This time I went north, sticking to the surface and trying to grab metal salvage whenever possible. Once I got back, I made 3 fire extinguishers to replace the 2 I'd used, along with a scanner, which would let me start unlocking some new blueprints. After that, the sun started to go down, and while I wanted to go out and keep gathering resources, I couldn't really afford to be wandering around aimlessly in the dark, so I decided to just sit and wait for dawn. Once the sun returned, I made my way out to the kelp forest. And although he wasn't too happy about it, I was able to steal 4 pieces of metal salvage from a stalker. I used these to craft some more fire extinguishers and started exploring some caves, getting my first pieces of gold, silver, and lead while I was at it. Then I went back and continued exploring the safe shallows. I found a small wreck with a neighboring stalker nest, and this allowed me to get some more scrap. I was going to start heading back as the sun went down, but then I got an idea. With my limited mobility, I wasn't expecting to be able to catch any fish during this run, but then I remembered that they're a lot less active at night. And because of this, I was able to catch a bladderfish, which would end up becoming one of my most useful acquisitions of the run. Once I could see again, I grabbed a couple of creepvine seeds and went back to the life pod, where I used the bladderfish to craft an air bladder. This would let me get to the surface much quicker than before, and unlike the fire extinguishers, it wouldn't cost me a thing. But before I could go test it, I had to wait to die. As mentioned before, catching fish is pretty hard, which meant that, for much of the run, it just wasn't practical to feed myself. Luckily, dying in a base doesn't actually cost you anything, making it an easy way to replenish your hunger and thirst. Once that was done, I went back out and kept exploring. I'd managed to craft a knife and used it to get some table coral for a computer chip. Then I went to the kelp forest and found it had another use as a very limited form of self-defense. While I was there, I wanted to explore some of the caves to try and get some more silver, But it was getting dark, so I just kinda hung out on the surface until morning. I got the notification that the Aurora was going to explode soon, which kind of worried me, given the radiation and just how close my life pod was, but I figured I'd cross that bridge when I came to it. Once the sun came up, I checked out the caves, which unfortunately didn't have much, so I kept looking. But when I finally found a cave that did look promising, a crash fish snuck up and killed me. I'd lost a lot of gear from that, so I decided to just exit without saving, and luckily my previous save was only about 2 minutes behind. For some reason, this gave me the blueprint for the radiation suit, even though the Aurora had not yet exploded, but aside from being kind of funny, it didn't really affect anything. Then I went home and decided to hold off on exploring the cave until after I died, so my health would be back to full. While I waited for that to happen, I decided to use one of my silver to craft a high-capacity O2 tank. I figured it would make getting more silver easier, and it also used up some of my resources, which was good since my storage was starting to fill up. I also had the idea to take one of my flares with me. Not only could they be used to distract stalkers, which were currently a big source of my health loss, but they were also a cheap and easy way to light up caves. Then I died, made my way back to the kelp forest, and started exploring. Between the flare and my upgraded O2 tank, I was actually able to spend a little time in the cave, and while I only got 1 silver, the proof of concept was there. So after refilling my air, I went back down and got the last piece of silver I needed. Then I went home and put that silver towards a habitat builder, which I used to build myself a very rudimentary base. By now, the Aurora had actually exploded, so I decided to try and make a radiation suit. Luckily, I already had plenty of lead from all the sandstone I'd broken, and the fiber mesh was easily sourced from the kelp forest. Put those together, and a little over 2 hours into the run, I finally had myself a radiation suit. Now that I had a radiation suit and a habitat builder, it opened up a lot of new options. For reasons I'll get into in a bit, I knew one of my goals was going to be to get a battery charger. To do that, I'd need to scan 2 fragments. They're only found in the grassy plateaus, Rex, but luckily there was one not too far to my south. So after grabbing a bit more titanium, I made some fire extinguishers and headed out. On the way, I managed to discover my first proper wreck. I wasn't able to get into the back room since I didn't have a repair tool, but I was still able to snag the blueprints for the grav trap and swivel chair, which would actually end up being really useful later on. Then I kept going, eventually reaching the grassy plateaus and heading deeper than I'd ever gone before. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game on the market, and you can play it for free on PC, console, and mobile. War Thunder's fantastic graphics, original sound design, and riveting gameplay make for an immersive experience like no other. One thing I love about War Thunder is that every vehicle is modeled down to an insane level of detail, and individual components such as crew, weapons, engines, and fuel tanks can all suffer varying levels of damage, forcing you to change your tactics on the fly. With over 2,500 vehicles from 10 major nations, including battleships, tanks, fighter jets, and more, War Thunder has something for everyone. And if you're playing on a lower-end device, don't worry, as War Thunder's homegrown Dagger engine has been heavily optimized to deliver a visually pleasing, lag-free experience for everyone. So join a community of over 70 million players by checking out the links in the description or pinned comment. For a limited time, new and returning players after 6 months on both PC and console will receive a limited time bonus pack including 100,000 Silver Lions, 7 days of premium account, multiple premium vehicles, and the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor. So don't waste any time and go check out War Thunder today. Now you're probably wondering how I plan to breathe down here, and this is where the habitat builder and air bladder really start to shine. For whatever reason, you can fill up an air bladder even if you're in an unpowered base, and with a bit of patience, you can use this to completely refill your O2 tanks. After doing this, I entered the wreck, excited to finally make some progress, only to realize there wasn't a single battery charger fragment to be found. This was not good, and to understand why, it's helpful to zoom out a little bit. This is roughly where my life pod landed, and these are the 5 grassy plateau wrecks that each have a chance to spawn battery charger fragments. I was hoping they'd just be here, in the southernmost wreck, because not only is it the second closest, but it's also one of just a couple that doesn't require a laser cutter, a tool that I'm currently unable to get. But hold on, why do I even want the battery charger in the first place? Well, it's a pretty important part of my plan to get the prawn suit. A vehicle that, if I could get a hold of it, would be nothing short of a game changer. You see, while the prawn suit by itself isn't all that useful, if you attach a grapple arm, you can use it to pull yourself around. And this has 3 main advantages over the fire extinguisher. First, you get the perks of having a built-in oxygen supply wherever you go. Next, there's no material cost to move around, which means if I can get one, I can essentially eliminate the risk of getting soft-locked. Finally, the prawn suit also works on land, somewhere I currently can't go and will need to visit when exploring the various alien bases. So in order to even have a chance at this challenge, I needed to get the prawn suit, and to do that, I needed the battery charger. But if I wasn't getting it here, then where was I? Well, there was another option. A second wreck that didn't require a laser cutter and would basically guarantee me the fragments I needed. The catch is that it's a lot farther away and notoriously difficult to navigate, but if I could pull it off, I'd be able to get the fragments for the battery charger and probably some other useful stuff as well. So I got to work. Since I'd already come all the way out to the southern wreck, I tried to make the most of it by getting as much titanium and sandstone as possible. Then, instead of heading back manually, which would be both slow and expensive, I simply entered and left my temporary base before deconstructing it and waiting to drown. Since dying only causes you to lose items you've picked up since you were last in a base, I was able to just respawn back at home with all of my resources. I took some of the silver and used it to make a rebreather before heading back to the wreck to get another haul of titanium. Then, after a little more resource gathering, I set out towards the new wreck. It was slow going, but I did start to realize just how far a single fire extinguisher could get you if you were patient. Once I got to the wreck, I built a small base for air and headed inside. And yeah, this part was not fun. With the way it's oriented, exploring this wreck is already a bit annoying under normal conditions, but with my limited mobility and the fact that I can only move backwards, it was definitely a struggle. Luckily, the 2 battery charger fragments weren't too deep, and after going in for a second time, I was also able to scan all 3 modification and 2 of the 3 mobile vehicle bay fragments. Then I broke a bit more sandstone and headed back home. With the ability to make a battery charger, my plan to get the prawn suit was at least theoretically possible, but there were still a few more things I had to do. Aside from 1 other mobile vehicle bay fragment, I was going to need 2 fragments for the prawn suit grapple arm. Then to actually craft it, I needed to use a vehicle upgrade console, which I didn't have the blueprint for. To make things even more complicated, the console itself can only be built in a moon pool, which is another 2 fragments. Of all these, I felt the grapple arm blueprints would probably be the most difficult, so I decided to focus on getting those and sort of just hope the other ones would work themselves out along the way. Before I left, I wanted to make another high-capacity O2 tank, and after searching more than a few caves, one of them was finally kind and gave me the silver I needed. I made the tank, giving me an extra 60 seconds of air, along with a grav trap so I could actually start catching some food. Then I made some fire extinguishers and got ready to leave. All was going well until I remembered I forgot to get the stuff to build a base, so I was forced to kill myself and start over. The solar panel in the hatch needed quartz, which of course I didn't have, so it was back to collecting resources. I died to a gasopod, that one was new, but eventually I made it to one of the big tube corals and got the quartz. After that, I set out for real. Of all the wrecks that can spawn grapple arm fragments, I was specifically drawn to this one in the Grand Reef. It was big enough to likely have both fragments, only around 700 meters from the life pod, and relatively safe. After around 1.5 fire extinguishers, I crossed into the Grand Reef and made my way to the wreck. I built a temporary base, and thankfully the solar panel gave me just enough power to make everything work. Then, on my way into the wreck, I got incredibly lucky, finding both moonpool fragments just sitting there. To my surprise, the good luck actually continued into the wreck, and after finding a fragment for the prawn suit drill arm, I got both of the grappling arm fragments. I returned back to the temporary base and was actually feeling pretty good. That was until I started looking at everything I actually needed to make all this stuff. I don't know why, but when I started this whole process, my focus was almost entirely on just getting the blueprints, with the actual materials being more of an afterthought. But when I started looking at all the crafting recipes, I realized that getting some of these materials was going to be anything but an afterthought. You had your usual stuff that would be annoying, but not impossible to get. Things like titanium ingots for the moonpool and an advanced wiring kit for the prawn. But then there were the other things. 3 blood oil for some benzene, 2 gel sacks and rubies for aerogel, alongside 5 pieces of lithium and 2 diamonds. I was able to find the rubies and gel sacks relatively close by, and the blood oil was close enough to somewhere that I already planned to go, but the diamonds and lithium were another story. They mostly dropped from shale outcrops, and I had yet to even find a single one. And to get 5 lithium at a 31% drop chance, I wasn't just gonna have to break 1 or 2 shale, but well over a dozen. Normally at this point, my go-to place to get shale is the mountain island, but since I still can't move on land, that obviously wouldn't work. What I needed was somewhere underwater with lots of shale that also wasn't too far away. And that's when it hit me. Sea treaders. They dig up shale when they walk, and one of their paths just so happens to cut through the Grand Reef. It was another 700 meters away and double my current depth, but if I could make it, I'd be rewarded with a nearly endless amount of shale, so I figured it was worth a shot. I deconstructed the base and began the trek. And whenever I started to run low on air, I just popped down a quick base and used the air bladder to refill my tanks. At one point, I looked up and almost had a heart attack when I saw a ghost leviathan, but thankfully he never really bothered me. I also grabbed some sandstone because even if it wasn't my main priority, I wasn't just going to turn down good materials if they were right in front of me. Finally, after a couple more oxygen breaks, I made it. I built a base to refill my air, and with a group of sea treaders headed my way, there wasn't any time to lose. The first group came, so I collected what I could, and it wasn't long before another sea treader passed by. But then, as I was just 1 lithium short of my goal, the sea treaders just stopped showing up. I started looking online for answers and found someone on Reddit who said they stopped spawning if you built a base nearby. This was kind of a problem since I needed a base to breathe, but after deconstructing it and searching around the path for a bit, I eventually found one. And after just barely not drowning, I broke a bit more shale and got the last piece of lithium. I could have maybe chased the sea treader down to get a bit more stuff, but I was down to my last fire extinguisher, so I decided to just call it there and respawn back at the life pod. Now that I was back, I took stock of my situation. I put all of my titanium together, and not including what I used to make the base, I had 30, which was actually a bit more than I had thought. Then I built a battery charger and AFK'd at it while I thought about what to do. I still had to go on one more trip to get the blueprint for the vehicle upgrade console as well as the blood oil, and I was worried it would use up the rest of my titanium. And since I was also going to need another 30 to 40 titanium to actually build everything related to the prawn suit, I got an idea. I would get enough resources to build a powered base with a fabricator, and then head to the crash zone, where I'd use all the metal salvage to make some titanium ingots and mass-produce fire extinguishers. Then I'd use some of those fire extinguishers to visit a wreck in the sparse reef, where I could get the blueprint for the vehicle upgrade console, as well as getting the 3 blood oil from the nearby blood kelp trench. I put my plan into action, and on the way to the crash zone, I decided to check out a cargo box. This paid off big time, and I was able to get the last fragment for the mobile vehicle bay. Then I reached the crash zone and started collecting all of that sweet titanium. Whenever I ran out of nearby scrap, I simply packed up my base and moved somewhere new. After doing this a few times, my inventory filled up, so I deconstructed everything in the base and headed back home. While my supply of raw titanium had decreased, I'd essentially managed to turn 4 fire extinguishers into 16, along with another 30 titanium and ingots. After sorting everything out, I turned around and started heading towards the wreck in the sparse reef. Luckily, the data box I was looking for was outside, as I still didn't have a laser cutter, but when I tried going down to the wreck, I realized I'd forgotten my rebreather, so I had to exit without saving and basically redo the last 11 minutes of my life. Eventually, though, I did make it back. I built a base to replenish my O2 and got the blueprint for the vehicle upgrade console. Then it was just a hop, skip, and a jump to the Blood Kelp Trench. Night fell while I was there, and it ended up getting really dark, so I had to drop a flare at my base to mark the way back. But nevertheless, I was able to get the 3 pieces of blood oil, along with a bit more quartz. And with that, I had all of the materials and blueprints I needed, save for the prawn suit itself. And little did I know, the journey to get that blueprint would make everything I'd done up to this point look like a cakewalk. There was no putting it off anymore. It was time to go to the Aurora. Between the radiation, fire, and Auto Leviathan, the Aurora is already somewhere that isn't particularly safe to visit. But throw in the confines of this challenge and it becomes seemingly impossible. At this point, the problem should be pretty obvious. Both of the ship's entrances and a sizable part of its interior are above water, a place where I am completely immobile. The problem is, there's 2 things here that I really need. We've already talked about the prawn suit, but arguably even more important is the terminal in the captain's quarters with the blueprint for the Neptune escape rocket. I could maybe figure out a way to explore the alien bases without a prawn suit, but no matter what, I needed the rocket to beat the game. The one good thing was that the prawn suit fragments and the rocket terminal were relatively close to one another, but still, how was I going to make it all the way over to them if I couldn't even get 2 feet from the shore? Thankfully, I had a plan. Around 6 months ago, I'd been messing around with building in the Aurora, because I really wanted to see if you could snake a base through the ship in order to build in the drive room. I ended up finding a much easier method, but not before I discovered something rather interesting. Players might recall that you used to be able to despawn things like wrecks and leviathans by building a base inside of them. This was pretty overpowered, so when the Living Large update was rolled out in December of 2022, it wasn't too surprising that this got patched. But for whatever reason, probably because the devs never actually expected anyone to try building here, this trick still works inside of the Aurora. So in theory, the plan was relatively simple. Use bases to despawn the inside of the Aurora, then make my way over to the prawn bay and captain's quarters. But of course, things are rarely easier said than done, and I would soon find out why. After getting everything I needed, I made my way over to the Aurora. Then once I felt I was close enough to the front, I started building. The closest entrance was 38 meters up, so I first had to gain a decent bit of height. I came up with a method that, while slow, didn't leave any base pieces behind. This was important because I didn't bring any extra materials, and having pieces of the base left behind could cause issues whenever I died to refill my hunger. Before long, I got the height I needed, but then came the really painful part. Horizontal movement. The method itself was simple. Build a base in front of me, deconstruct the one behind me, and use chairs to inch my way forward. But boy was it time consuming. The first day came and went, and so did the second. By the next morning, the 4 batteries I'd brought were almost all dead. I knew it wasn't practical to bring enough for the entire trip, and that's where the battery charger comes into play. Whenever my batteries started running low, I just put down a solar panel, built the battery charger, and then AFK'd while everything recharged. Eventually, I did reach the front of the ship, and after squeezing through a gap in the hull, I made a right-hand turn and started heading for the entrance. Things weren't all going to plan though, and right away, I noticed these falling chunks of metal can still hit you inside a base. At first, I didn't think much of it, but when I was AFKing to recharge my batteries again, one of the metal chunks landed on my base and actually destroyed my solar panel, which was something I didn't even know was possible. Thankfully, I'd saved pretty recently, so I was able to reload, and this time I built a base piece over the solar panel to hopefully protect it from any more falling debris. With that taken care of, I carried on, and to my utter amazement, I was able to despawn the first hallway and make my way inside without anything going wrong. A bit later, I reached the end of where the hallway should have been, and behind it there was a wall. This might have been an issue, but I'd actually scouted this part ahead of time and knew there was a way under it. Thankfully, going down with this setup was way easier than going up, and after a few rows, I was able to get under the wall. Then I passed the big dark barrier and I was in. I could see the prawn bay off in the distance, but before I could get to it, I wanted to get the blueprint for the rocket, so I slowly inched my way towards the captain's quarters. But then there was a problem. I wanted to charge my batteries for the final push, but when I got everything set up, my solar panel just wasn't working. I didn't know if I had enough power left to get both blueprints, but at this point I just had to go for it and hope for the best. I made my way over to the captain's quarters, dropped down a couple more levels, and there it was, the data terminal I'd been looking for. I got as close as I could and then exited the base, grabbing the blueprint on my way down. Now I just had to get to the prawn bay and scan for fragments. But before I built over there from the captain's quarters, I decided to use a fire extinguisher and see if I could clip into the prawn bay from underneath. It didn't really work, but I was able to scan 3 fragments from beneath the floor, so all I had to do now was get one of the 2 hanging from the ceiling. And after a few more minutes of building, that's exactly what I did. I took off my radiation helmet, waited to die, and after a solid 5 hours, I was finally home. Right away, I turned my attention to making the prawn suit. I started out by building a moon pool and a vehicle upgrade console, then used it to craft the grapple arm. Then I made the mobile vehicle bay, and at long last, I had gotten the prawn suit. With the prawn suit, it felt like a whole new world had opened up to me. Which was good, because I still had a lot of work to do. Since I'd only been doing things that I felt were essential to getting the prawn, I'd inadvertently skipped over a lot of stuff, and as a result, there were still some pretty basic blueprints and items that I just didn't have. So, in what I dare say is the most normal part of this run, it was time to go back and collect all the stuff I'd missed. But first, I decided to go out and resupply on titanium. During this trip, I learned a lot about piloting the prawn suit. While it was by far my best way to move, it wasn't without its faults. It had a tendency to get stuck, especially in the kelp forest where there's a lot of trenches, and this led to some trips taking way longer than they probably should have. Still, I was able to get a bunch of scrap, and with titanium no longer a concern, I fixed up my life pod and built a radio. Next, I headed for a wreck in the grassy plateaus, looking to get the blueprint for the laser cutter. It didn't end up being in the wreck itself, but on the way back home, I found a couple of cargo boxes that gave me the fragments. Luckily, I had everything to make it on hand, and with it, I traveled out to explore a couple more wrecks to my south. First was the wreck in the sparse reef where I'd gotten the blueprint for the vehicle upgrade console. This time, the reinforced dive suit was my main priority. Then I headed a little bit south to visit Lifepod 19. I didn't want to get my prawn suit stuck in the chasm, so I headed down the old-fashioned way, getting the blueprint for the ultra-high-capacity O2 tank, along with a few more precious resources. Once I got back up, I headed next door to a large wreck in the Sea Treader's path. It was here that I had my first real encounter with a warper. The reason they never attacked me in the Grand Reef is that warpers don't actually care about you until you reach a certain infection level. Since these levels are only triggered when you go to certain locations, warpers won't actually attack you if you haven't been to the mountains, Aurora, or Lost River. Unfortunately, since I'd now been to the Aurora, this one did start attacking me. Luckily, they still aren't at their most aggressive, so after warping me out of my prawn suit a couple times, it mostly left me alone, which let me scan 3 Cyclops bridge and 1 hull fragment. Then came the part I really wasn't looking forward to, climbing back up to the shallows from the sparse reef. The singular grapple arm made it pretty difficult, but after a bit of finagling, I was able to get back up. is what I would have said if I didn't immediately fall 100 meters back down into the Grand Reef. I was eventually able to get back up using the small area where the kelp forest borders the Grand Reef, and after what was probably the most painful 30 minutes of my life, I made it back home. I spent a bit of time sorting out all my items because hey, even though I'm doing a challenge, it doesn't mean I can't have a few nice things. Then I started getting some radio transmissions, although their actual usefulness was a bit limited. LifePod 7 had literally nothing of value to me, and a bit later I got the waypoint for LifePod 19, which would have been way more useful like an hour ago, but I suppose beggars can't be choosers. I cooked up some food to avoid imminent death and then set out to the north. Besides my extended trip to the Aurora, I hadn't really been to this half of the map yet, and there were quite a few spots I wanted to check out. My first stop was the wreck in the underwater islands. I'd gotten one Cyclops engine fragment in the crash zone earlier on, and this wreck was going to be the best place to get the other two. Like with LifePod 19, I couldn't take my prawn suit directly there, so I parked it on the edge of the biome and made my way in. I found the second fragment for the prawn suit drill arm, which was a nice surprise, before finding and scanning the last two engine fragments. After that, I followed the ridge around the underwater islands, which eventually led me to the mountain island. I made my way up, but as I was trying to grab a couple seeds, I made a bit of an unfortunate discovery. You see, I've been playing a lot of Below Zero lately, and in that game, when you leave a prawn suit on land, it puts you directly in front of it almost every time. But in Subnautica, it seemingly teleports you to a random spot. And the problem is, some of these spots are far enough away that I can't get back in the prawn suit, leaving me stuck. The way I got around this was by saving before I got out and reloading if I got unlucky. But that still meant I had to try and limit getting in and out of the prawn suit as much as possible. Nevertheless, I was still able to get a purple tablet and make my way into the quarantine enforcement platform. I got some ion cubes, and aside from the annoyingness of having to get in and out to activate terminals, the facility itself was actually pretty easy to navigate. I couldn't go down the elevator without my prawn suit getting stuck, so I went back up and headed for the caves. Here I had two goals: activate the teleporter at the top of the cave so I could visit the floating island and get grow beds, and collect as much lithium as possible. The first goal ended up being impossible. I couldn't fit my prawn into the cave with the portal, and with most of the cave network being beyond this point, my ability to get lithium was also quite hampered. It wasn't the end of the world, I could still get both the lithium and grow beds elsewhere, but it meant I was done with the mountain island for now. My second to last stop was the wreck in the northwestern mushroom forest. On the way there, I stumbled across LifePod 3 by complete accident, and this one actually had something I wanted: the blueprint for the compass. After getting that, I crossed through the grassy plateaus and arrived at the wreck. With the engine and bridge fragments out of the way, the only thing I still needed for the Cyclops blueprint were the two hull fragments. And after a bit of searching, I was able to find them at the bottom of the wreck. Last but not least, I went to the edge of the northern blood kelp to get some blood oil and deep shrooms. I was gonna also visit a wreck in the bulb zone to scan the outdoor grow bed, but since I'd never actually repaired the Aurora's drive core, the whole area was covered in radiation, so I'd have to come back for the grow bed later. And after making it home and crafting a couple upgrades, that's exactly what I did. With the blueprint acquired, I popped down a grow bed and planted some blood oil, gel sacks, and deep shrooms, before AFKing for a bit to let everything grow. Now that all my equipment and blueprints were caught up to where they should be, it was time to start preparing for the push. The eventual trek through the Lost River, inactive lava zone, and lava lakes. To do this, the prawn suit was the obvious choice. It could provide me with oxygen, protection, and allow me to navigate the alien bases. But it did have one flaw. At the moment, it can only go down to 900 meters. This is fine for the Lost River, but to access the lava zones, we'll need the MK1 and MK2 depth modules. The resources to make them aren't an issue, but actually crafting them is. The first depth module can only be made at a vehicle upgrade console, and the second at a modification station. Normally you just craft these back up at your base, but since I already knew just how painful it would be to try and climb out of the Lost River with nothing but a grapple arm, I wanted to do this whole trip in one go. That meant I'd have to bring the stuff to build a modification station, moon pool, and vehicle upgrade console. To power all of this stuff, thermal seemed like the obvious choice, but I only had one of the two magnetite to make it, so I'd have to try and get a piece from the jelly shroom caves. But before I did that, I built a drill arm and another grapple arm for my prawn, which I then used to go out and mine all of the lithium I could ever possibly need. After that, I snagged a piece of magnetite from the jelly shroom cave, and mined a couple of diamonds from the sparse reef, which I used to make a reinforced dive suit. And with that, I was just about ready to go. So after putting everything in my prawn and checking multiple times to ensure I didn't forget anything, I left my base and made for the Bloodkelp Trench. Once I jumped in, there wouldn't really be any turning back, but I wasn't going to be beating the game from up here, so after a moment I hopped in. I got a little turned around once I hit the bottom, but after pushing past a couple of crab squids, I'd officially made it to the Lost River. Swapping one of my grapple arms out for a drill arm, I mined up some nickel and used it to build the first depth module. After deconstructing everything, I grabbed 4 pieces of crystalline sulfur and started going deeper. I passed the junction leading to the disease research facility, but since it isn't actually required to beat the game, I instead turned left and headed for the tree cove. It was a nice bit of calm after all of the chaos of the Lost River, but unfortunately it was over about as quick as it began, and a moment later I was down in the inactive lava zone. This was easily the most dangerous biome I'd been to so far, and I couldn't even get into the main chamber without a couple of warpers harassing me. Eventually though, I did make it, and I started looking around for kyanite. It wasn't that hard to find, and luckily the first deposit gave me everything I needed. So I built another temporary base and used it to upgrade my depth module. Then began my trek to the alien thermal plant. I found the lava castle pretty quickly, but actually getting inside was another story. For whatever reason, I can never seem to remember where the entrances are, and it wasn't helped by the warpers, who were hell-bent on sending me back to the life pod. It took a few attempts, but I was eventually able to find the entrance, and after a short trip through the lava tubes, I'd arrived at the alien thermal plant. I was a bit worried about how I was going to get the prawn suit inside, but compared to climbing up the lava castle, it actually wasn't that bad. From there, I did all the usual stuff. I grabbed the blue tablet, mined up some ion cubes, and got the blueprint for the ion power cells. Back in the lava tubes, I made a second blue tablet and continued down. I found the entrance to the lava lakes, which took longer than I'd like to admit, and now there was just one big room standing between me and the end. This time it wasn't the warpers after me, but the sea dragon. Somehow I actually managed to get away from him. I think he swam into a wall or something. I really wasn't going to go back and check. And after having to take a bit of a detour around all the lava, I reached the primary containment facility. From there, everything went as you might expect. I used the 2 blue tablets to open up the doors and jumped into the Sea Emperor's aquarium. I used an ion cube on the incubator and opened up the portal back to the surface, getting the blueprint for the hatching enzymes in return. Luckily, I had already taken the time to gather 4 of the 5 ingredients, so after going into a small cave to grab a sea crown seed, I went through the portal and made a temporary base to craft the enzyme. Then I popped back down, hatching the baby Sea Emperors, and finally ridding myself of the infection once and for all. With that done, there was just one thing left to do, so I bid the Sea Emperor goodbye and headed back up to disable the quarantine enforcement platform. This actually ended up being rather annoying, because no matter how many times I left the prawn, I just could not get it to put me in the right spot. It actually got to the point where I started to wonder if there was something physically preventing me from spawning in front of the button, but no, I was just getting really unlucky. And after what very well could have been 30 resets, I was eventually put in the right spot. With the story wrapped up, it's time for everyone's favorite part of the game, getting the 3 million different things you need to build a rocket. I grabbed a few resources on my way home, and then after unloading the prawn, I set about getting the 90 titanium I needed for both the Cyclops and the rocket. Thankfully, the crash zone still had more than enough metal salvage, and after making one more trip to mine some copper and gold, I realized I was pretty darn close to having everything I needed. So I took my mobile vehicle bay out to the grassy plateaus and built a Cyclops. Even though I'm literally incapable of piloting it, you still need to make one in order to build the Cyclops shield generator, which was a little bit annoying, but honestly at this point in the game, it wasn't even that expensive. I used my old chair tactic to get to the fabricator, and after crafting a couple more things back in the life pod, I had everything I needed. All that was left to do was build the rocket and get the heck out of here. Okay, maybe it wasn't gonna be quite that simple. For a while, the rocket was actually the one part of this challenge that I couldn't figure out. In order to use it, you have to activate 5 switches and then sit down in the chair. The problem is, none of my methods for moving around worked inside the rocket. The fire extinguisher was obviously a no-go, the prawn suit wouldn't fit through the front door, and you can't build stuff like chairs in it either. The 3 switches in the fuel reserve were at least barely possible to get to if you built a base over the rocket and dropped down before finishing the cockpit. But interacting with the stuff in the cockpit itself seemed impossible. I did figure out a way that I could get inside, but it was super finicky, and I never found a single setup where I could access both terminals and sit in the chair. So how was I gonna do this? Well, like a lot of other things in this challenge, the method I found was a bit convoluted and probably took 3 times as long, but the important thing was, it worked. The first step was to start building the rocket under the water. You see, as long as you have a few base pieces to hold everything down, you can use the mobile vehicle bay in a moon pool and basically build the rocket at any depth you want. This makes flipping the first 3 switches a lot easier, but the game forces you to stop swimming when you enter the rocket, so moving around in the cockpit was still an issue. The solution to this was actually the prawn suit. That's right, the vehicle that had carried me through half of this challenge still had one more gift left to give. I realized that by dropping the prawn suit into the fuel reserve, you can enter and leave it to trick the game into thinking you're underwater. Then it was as simple as climbing the ladder, activating the remaining terminals, and after just under 23 hours, I sat down in the chair and took off, proving that yes, with enough planning, patience, and a certain level of self-hatred that would cause someone to attempt something this dumb in the first place, you can indeed beat Subnautica without moving. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. You can play it for free right now on PC, console, and mobile devices using the links in the description or pinned comment. And if you're new or haven't played in the last 6 months, you'll also receive a massive bonus pack on PC and console that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account. It's only available for a limited time, so don't miss it.